In the autumn of 1837, the small village of Thornfield in Yorkshire's West Riding bore witness to events that would forever alter the lives of the Ashworth family and cast a shadow over the community that persists in whispered conversations to this day. What began as a simple tale of trespass would evolve into something far more sinister, challenging the very foundations of what the residents believed they knew about their neighbours, their children, and themselves. The case first came to public attention through a brief mention in the Thornfield Parish Register, where Reverend Edmund Blackwood noted an unusual entry dated October 15th, 1837. The entry, written in the Reverend's careful script, spoke of a disturbance at the Ashworth dwelling involving a young woman of unknown origin. No further details were provided in the official record, yet this single line would later prove to be the first thread in unraveling a mystery that defied conventional explanation. The Ashworth family had resided in Thornfield for 3 generations. Samuel Ashworth, a man of 42 years, worked as a blacksmith and was known throughout the village for his steady temperament and reliable craftsmanship. His wife, Margaret, 38 years of age, maintained their modest stone cottage with the precision expected of a Yorkshire housewife. The couple had been married for 18 years and were childless, a circumstance that had become a source of quiet speculation among the villagers, though never discussed openly in their presence. Their home sat approximately half a mile from the village centre, positioned at the edge of Thornfield Common, where ancient oak trees formed a natural boundary between cultivated land and the wild moorland beyond. The cottage itself was unremarkable, built of local stone with a slate roof that had weathered countless Yorkshire winters. A small garden provided vegetables for the household, and a workshop adjacent to the main dwelling served Samuel's blacksmithing trade. According to parish records examined decades later, the first indication of unusual activity at the Ashworth property came from Thomas Whitmore, a neighbouring farmer whose land bordered theirs to the east. Whitmore, a man of 61 years, known for his taciturn nature, approached Reverend Blackwood on October 10, 1837, with what he described as concerns about sounds coming from the Ashworth place during the night hours. The farmer's account, preserved in a letter discovered among the Reverend's papers in 1958, described hearing what sounded like a child's voice singing nursery rhymes at hours when decent folk should be abed. Whitmore noted that these sounds occurred with increasing frequency over several weeks, always between midnight and dawn, and always emanating from the vicinity of the Ashworth cottage. When questioned about the matter, Samuel Ashworth reportedly dismissed the neighbours' concerns with unusual sharpness, claiming that Whitmore was mistaken about the source of any sounds he might have heard. Margaret Ashworth, when approached separately by the Reverend, became visibly distressed and insisted that nothing unusual had occurred at their home. Her reaction, described by Reverend Blackwood as uncommonly agitated for a woman of her typically composed nature, raised additional questions that would remain unanswered for years. The morning of October 15th marked the incident that would transform idle village gossip into documented concern. According to multiple witnesses, including the parish constable Robert Grimshaw, the Ashworth cottage was discovered in a state of considerable disorder. Furniture had been displaced, food was scattered across the kitchen floor, and most remarkably, items of clothing belonging to a young woman were found in the main bedroom. Despite the known absence of any female guests, Mary Holloway, the village seamstress who was summoned to examine the garments, later testified that the clothing appeared to be of good quality, but showed signs of having been worn extensively. The garments included a blue dress of fine wool, white cotton undergarments, and leather shoes that showed considerable wear. Most puzzling was a yellow ribbon found among the items, its bright colour unusual for the typically subdued palette favoured by local women. The constable's report filed with the magistrate in nearby Harrogate, noted that both Samuel and Margaret Ashworth appeared greatly disturbed by the discovery, but offered no explanation for how the items came to be in their home. When pressed for details about recent visitors or unusual occurrences, the couple maintained that nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. It was during this initial investigation that the first mention of the girl with golden hair appeared in official records. Sarah Pemberton, a widow who lived nearest to the Ashworth cottage, told Constable Grimshaw that she had observed a young woman with distinctively fair hair near the property on several occasions during the preceding month. Pemberton described the woman as appearing to be approximately 20 years of age, of slight build, and always alone when spotted. The witness accounts varied in their details, but several patterns emerged from testimonies collected by the constable. The mysterious woman was consistently described as having unusually pale, almost white blonde hair that caught the light in a manner that made her easily recognizable from a distance. She was always seen during daylight hours, never after sunset, and appeared to move with familiarity around the Ashworth property as if she belonged there. Most disturbing was the testimony of young Peter Hawthorne, the miller's son, who claimed to have observed the woman entering the Ashworth cottage through an unlocked door while the couple was away at market. The boy, though only 12 years of age, provided a detailed account of watching the woman move through the house, appearing to examine furniture and belongings before settling in the main bedroom for what he estimated to be several hours. When Samuel and Margaret returned from market on that particular day, according to young Hawthorne's account, they discovered the woman inside their home. Rather than expressing surprise or alarm, the couple appeared to engage in what the boy described as urgent conversation with the intruder before all three individuals disappeared into the cottage, closing the door firmly behind them. The constable's attempts to locate this mysterious woman proved fruitless. No family in Thornfield or the surrounding villages reported a missing daughter or houseguest matching the description provided by witnesses. Letters sent to neighboring parishes yielded no information about any young woman of the described appearance. It was as if she had materialized from the moorland itself and vanished just as mysteriously. As October progressed into November, the situation at the Ashworth cottage grew increasingly peculiar. Delivery merchants noted that the family's orders for household supplies increased dramatically, particularly requests for additional bedding, women's toiletries, and foodstuffs. Samuel Ashworth, previously known for his frugal nature, began purchasing items that seemed unusual for a childless couple, including hair ribbons, small mirrors, and delicate soaps typically favored by young women. The couple's behavior during this period was documented by several observers. Margaret Ashworth, who had previously maintained an active role in parish activities, ceased attending Sunday services without explanation. Samuel continued his blacksmithing work but became increasingly reclusive, declining social invitations and avoiding conversation with neighbors. When forced to interact with villagers, both husband and wife appeared strained and answered questions with unusual brevity. Dr. Jonathan Carlyle, the local physician, was summoned to the Ashworth cottage on November 23rd after Samuel requested treatment for what he described as nervous exhaustion affecting his wife. Dr. Carlyle's notes, discovered among his papers following his death in 1862, provide insight into the atmosphere within the cottage during this period. The physician described finding Margaret Ashworth in a state of considerable agitation, exhibiting symptoms he characterized as extreme nervousness and an unwillingness to discuss the causes of her distress. More significantly, Dr. Carlyle noted evidence that the cottage was being occupied by more individuals than the known residents, including the presence of additional place settings at the dining table and what appeared to be a third sleeping area arranged in the main bedroom. When questioned about these observations, Samuel Ashworth became defensive and insisted that no additional occupants were residing in the home. However, Dr. Carlyle noted hearing what sounded like movement from the upper floor during his visit, despite being told by Samuel that no one else was present in the cottage at that time. The physician's most disturbing observation concerned Margaret Ashworth's physical condition. He noted what appeared to be minor injuries to her hands and arms, consistent with defensive wounds, though the woman refused to explain how these injuries had occurred. When pressed on the matter, Margaret became increasingly distressed and repeatedly insisted that everything was as it should be in her home. December brought the first winter snows to Yorkshire, and with them, a change in the pattern of strange occurrences at the Ashworth cottage. The sounds that had previously troubled neighbours during nighttime hours ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that proved equally unsettling to those living nearby. Thomas Whitmore, the farmer whose initial complaints had brought the situation to official attention, reported that the cottage now appeared abandoned during daylight hours, with no smoke rising from the chimney despite the cold weather. However, lights were observed in the windows after midnight, moving from room to room in a pattern that suggested multiple occupants rather than the expected two. On December 18th, a significant development occurred that would provide investigators with their first tangible evidence of the mysterious woman's identity. While conducting routine maintenance on the village well, workers discovered a leather satchel that had apparently been concealed beneath the stone cover for an extended period. The satchel contained several items that would prove crucial to understanding the events that had unfolded. Among the contents were letters addressed to one Eleanor Fairfax, personal items, including a small silver locket containing a miniature portrait, and most significantly, a detailed diary written in a feminine hand that documented the writer's experiences over the course of several months. The diary entries, beginning in late August 1837, told a story that challenged everything the villagers thought they knew about the situation at the Ashworth cottage. The writer, who identified herself as Eleanor Fairfax, described arriving in Thornfield while travelling to visit relatives in Scotland. According to her account, she had become lost on the moors during a severe storm and sought shelter at the first dwelling she encountered. Eleanor's initial entries portrayed her stay at the Ashworth cottage as a temporary arrangement while she recovered from the ordeal of being lost in harsh weather. She described Samuel and Margaret as initially welcoming, offering her food and dry clothing while arrangements were made for her to continue her journey. However, subsequent entries revealed a gradual change in the nature of her situation. By mid-September, according to the diary, Eleanor had begun to suspect that her hosts were deliberately preventing her departure. Her attempts to send letters to her family were discouraged, and when she insisted on leaving to continue her journey, she was told that the roads were impassable due to continued bad weather. The diary entries from this period show increasing concern about her circumstances and growing awareness that she was being detained against her will. The entries from October provided the most disturbing revelations about life inside the Ashworth cottage, during the period when villagers had begun to notice unusual activity. Eleanor described being confined to the upper floor of the cottage during daylight hours, allowed downstairs only when she could be certain of avoiding detection by visitors or neighbours. She wrote of being forced to remain silent whenever voices were heard outside the cottage, and of being threatened with violence if she attempted to call for help. Most chilling were Eleanor's descriptions of Margaret Ashworth's behaviour during this period. The diary portrayed the older woman as becoming increasingly obsessed with Eleanor's appearance, particularly her distinctive blonde hair, which Margaret would brush and arrange for hours while speaking of the daughter she should have had. Eleanor wrote of feeling like a living doll, dressed and positioned according to Margaret's whims, while Samuel remained largely absent from these disturbing interactions. The diary's later entries revealed that Eleanor's situation had deteriorated further as autumn progressed. She described being forced to participate in elaborate domestic scenes orchestrated by Margaret, including mock tea parties where she was required to play the role of an obedient daughter. Any resistance to these activities resulted in punishment, including confinement to a small storage room beneath the cottage's main floor. Eleanor's final diary entry, dated December 10th, expressed her growing desperation and fear for her safety. She wrote of planning an escape attempt, noting that the winter weather might provide cover for her to flee across the moors to seek help from neighboring villages. The entry ended abruptly, with no indication of whether she had carried out this plan or what had prevented her from writing further entries. The discovery of Eleanor's diary prompted an immediate investigation by county authorities. Magistrate William Thornbury arrived in Thornfield on December 28th, accompanied by constables from Harrogate, to conduct a thorough examination of the Ashworth cottage and interview all involved parties. The officials found the cottage apparently abandoned, with no sign of recent occupancy, despite evidence that it had been inhabited until very recently. Personal belongings of both Samuel and Margaret Ashworth remained in place, including clothing, household items, and Samuel's blacksmithing tools. Most significantly, investigators discovered the storage room beneath the main floor that Eleanor had described in her diary. The underground chamber was approximately 6 feet square and accessible only through a concealed trapdoor in the cottage's kitchen floor. The space showed clear evidence of human occupation, including makeshift bedding, food containers, and what appeared to be restraints attached to the stone walls. The condition of these items suggested they had been used recently and regularly over an extended period. Further examination of the cottage revealed additional disturbing evidence. The bedroom that Eleanor had described as her primary confinement contained items clearly intended for a young woman, including clothing that matched the garments initially discovered by the constable in October. Hair ribbons, cosmetics, and personal items were arranged throughout the room in a manner that suggested they had been carefully selected and maintained by someone other than their intended user. Most unsettling was the discovery of numerous sketches and what appeared to be attempted portraits scattered throughout the cottage. These drawings, apparently created by Margaret Ashworth based on the artistic style and materials used, depicted a young woman with distinctively fair hair in various domestic poses. The sketches showed an obsessive attention to detail, particularly in the rendering of the subject's hair and facial features. The investigation team also uncovered correspondence hidden within the cottage that provided additional insight into the Ashworth couple's state of mind during the months preceding their disappearance. Letters between Samuel and Margaret, apparently written when one or both were away from the cottage, revealed a relationship strained by their shared secret and the psychological toll of maintaining Eleanor's captivity. Margaret's letters to her husband spoke of her growing attachment to their guest, and her belief that Eleanor had been sent to them to fill the void left by their childless state. These writings showed a progressive detachment from reality, with Margaret describing elaborate fantasies about the family life she imagined they could create with Eleanor as their adopted daughter. Samuel's responses revealed a different perspective on their situation. His letters expressed increasing anxiety about the risks they were taking and his desire to resolve the matter before they faced discovery and consequences. The correspondence suggested that Samuel viewed Eleanor's presence as a temporary situation that had spiraled beyond his control, while Margaret had become emotionally invested in maintaining the arrangement permanently. The search for Samuel and Margaret Ashworth extended throughout the winter months of 1838, with investigators examining the surrounding moorland and consulting with authorities in neighboring counties. No trace of the couple was found, despite extensive efforts that included searching abandoned buildings, interviewing travelers, and posting descriptions of the missing individuals at markets and inns throughout Yorkshire. The fate of Eleanor Fairfax proved equally mysterious. While her diary provided detailed information about her captivity, no evidence was found to indicate whether she had successfully escaped or what had happened to her after the final diary entry. Attempts to locate her family in Scotland proved unsuccessful, with no records found of any family named Fairfax in the regions where she claimed to be travelling. The investigation's most significant break came in the spring of 1838, when a shepherd discovered human remains in a remote area of the moors, approximately 3 miles from the Ashworth cottage. The location was a natural depression in the landscape, partially concealed by gorse bushes and accessible only to those familiar with the terrain. The remains were in a state consistent with exposure to winter weather, making identification difficult. However, items found with the body included clothing that matched garments missing from the Ashworth cottage and a small silver locket identical to the one described in Eleanor Fairfax's diary. Most conclusively, strands of distinctively pale blonde hair were found among the remains, confirming the identity of the deceased. The coroner's examination, conducted by Dr. Carlyle with assistance from colleagues in Harrogate, determined that death had occurred during the winter months, likely between December and February. The cause of death was attributed to exposure, though the coroner noted that the remains showed evidence of injuries that could have been inflicted either before or after death. The remote location and challenging terrain suggested that reaching this spot would have required either extensive knowledge of the moors or assistance from someone familiar with the area. The discovery of Eleanor's remains intensified the search for Samuel and Margaret Ashworth, who were now sought in connection with her death. However, despite renewed efforts by local and county authorities, no trace of the couple was ever found. Their fate remained a subject of speculation that would persist for decades. In the months following the discovery, additional details emerged that cast further light on the events leading to Eleanor's death. Analysis of her diary and the physical evidence suggested that she had indeed attempted the escape she had planned in her final entry. Items missing from the cottage included warm clothing and food supplies that would have been necessary for a winter journey across the moors. The circumstances of Eleanor's death raised disturbing questions about whether she had died as a result of the harsh conditions during her escape attempt, or whether her captors had pursued and confronted her during her flight. The injuries noted by the coroner were consistent with either scenario, leaving investigators unable to determine definitively whether Eleanor had died from exposure alone or had suffered violence at the hands of the Ashworths. Local residents provided additional testimony during the expanded investigation that revealed the extent to which the Ashworth couple had succeeded in concealing their activities. Several villagers admitted to having observed unusual behavior at the cottage throughout the autumn months, but had dismissed these observations as eccentric rather than sinister. The couple's long-standing reputation as respectable members of the community had provided them with a degree of trust that delayed recognition of the true nature of the situation. The case took an unexpected turn in late 1838, when a letter arrived at the magistrate's office claiming to be from Margaret Ashworth and postmarked from a coastal town in Northumberland. The letter, written in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting based on comparison with samples from the cottage, provided a partial confession to Eleanor's death while maintaining that it had been accidental. According to this letter, Margaret claimed that Eleanor had died during an attempt to flee the cottage during a severe winter storm. Margaret wrote that she and Samuel had pursued Eleanor onto the moors, intending to convince her to return for her own safety, but had discovered her body after she had succumbed to the cold. The letter stated that the couple had been unable to report the death due to fear of being accused of causing it, and had instead chosen to flee Thornfield. However, investigators noted several inconsistencies in this account that cast doubt on its veracity. The letter's postmark and timing suggested that it had been written months after Eleanor's estimated time of death, raising questions about why the couple had delayed so long before attempting to provide an explanation. Additionally, the remote location where Eleanor's body was found would have been nearly impossible to locate during winter conditions without extensive knowledge of the terrain. The letter's contents also contradicted details found in Eleanor's diary about the circumstances of her captivity. While Margaret's account portrayed Eleanor as a willing guest who had chosen to remain at the cottage despite opportunities to leave, the diary entries clearly documented forced confinement and deliberate attempts to prevent her departure. Despite the questionable nature of Margaret's letter, it represented the last communication from either of the missing Ashworths. Subsequent investigations failed to locate the couple in Northumberland or any other location, and no further correspondence was ever received. The letter was preserved among the case files, but authorities continued to treat both Samuel and Margaret as suspects in Eleanor's death. The Ashworth cottage remained empty following the investigation, with no relatives coming forward to claim the property or the couple's belongings. Local authorities sealed the building initially, but as months passed without resolution of the case, the cottage was eventually abandoned to the elements. The isolation of its location and the dark associations with recent events ensured that no new occupants sought to make use of the dwelling. Years passed before anyone attempted to document the full scope of what had occurred in Thornfield during that autumn and winter of 1837 and 1838. The initial investigation had focused on determining the facts of Eleanor's death and locating the missing Ashworths, but the broader implications of the case continued to disturb those who had witnessed its unfolding. Reverend Blackwood, who had served as the primary point of contact between the investigation and the local community, maintained detailed records of the events and their aftermath. His notes, discovered after his death in 1864, revealed the profound impact the case had on the village and its residents. The Reverend wrote extensively about the questions the case raised about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The psychological aspects of the case proved particularly challenging for contemporary understanding. The evidence suggested that Margaret Ashworth had gradually developed an obsessive attachment to Eleanor that had begun as maternal instinct, but had evolved into something far more disturbing. The elaborate domestic scenarios Eleanor described in her diary indicated a complete detachment from reality on Margaret's part, while Samuel's role appeared to have been that of a reluctant accomplice who had been unable to prevent his wife's behavior from escalating. Dr. Carlyle, whose medical training provided him with insights into the mental aspects of the case, wrote extensively about what he observed during his limited interactions with the couple. His notes described Margaret's behavior as consistent with what would later be understood as a form of psychological disorder, though the medical understanding of such conditions was limited during that era. The physician's observations suggested that Margaret had become convinced that Eleanor was genuinely her daughter, and that maintaining this delusion had required increasingly desperate measures. The case also raised questions about the social isolation that had enabled the situation to continue undetected for so long. Thornfield's rural nature and the Ashworth cottage's distance from neighbours had created conditions where unusual activity could occur without immediate discovery. The couple's established reputation in the community had further delayed recognition that something was seriously wrong, even when evidence of unusual circumstances was clearly present. Local historians who examined the case in subsequent decades noted that it represented a confluence of factors that had created optimal conditions for the tragedy that unfolded. The Ashworths' childlessness in a society that placed tremendous importance on family, their physical isolation from the community, and the arrival of a vulnerable young woman in desperate circumstances had combined to create a situation that neither social norms nor individual conscience had been sufficient to prevent. The investigation files from 1838 were archived with the county magistrate's office, where they remained largely undisturbed for several decades. It was not until the 1860s that scholarly interest in the case began to develop, prompted partly by growing understanding of psychological disorders and partly by the persistent local legends that had grown up around the abandoned Ashworth cottage. Dr. James Whitfield, a physician with interests in mental health who examined the case files in 1867, published the first comprehensive analysis of the psychological aspects of the case. His work, while limited by the scientific understanding of his era, provided insights that helped explain how seemingly normal individuals could commit acts that defied conventional morality. Dr. Whitfield's analysis focused particularly on Margaret Ashworth's mental state during the months of Eleanor's captivity. Based on the available evidence, including Eleanor's diary entries and witness observations, he concluded that Margaret had experienced what he termed a complete displacement of reality, in which she had become convinced that Eleanor was the daughter she had never been able to have naturally. The physician's work also examined Samuel's role in enabling his wife's behavior. Dr. Whitfield suggested that Samuel had initially participated in Eleanor's confinement out of misguided loyalty to his wife, but had gradually become trapped by the circumstances they had created. The correspondence between the couple suggested that Samuel had recognized the dangerous nature of their situation, but had been unable to find a way to resolve it without facing severe consequences. The abandoned cottage itself became a source of local folklore that persisted well into the 19th century. Travelers crossing the moors reported strange sounds emanating from the empty building, though these accounts were generally dismissed as products of superstition and the power of suggestion. The cottage's physical deterioration over time only added to its ominous reputation among those who remembered the events of 1837. By the 1870s, the cottage had fallen into significant disrepair. The roof had partially collapsed, allowing weather to damage the interior, and local vegetation had begun to encroach on the structure. Despite its deteriorating condition, the building remained a landmark of sorts, serving as a reminder of the dark events that had unfolded within its walls. The case continued to attract attention from those interested in criminal psychology and the darker aspects of human nature. Several writers attempted to create fictional accounts based on the known facts, though these efforts were generally criticized for sensationalizing events that had caused genuine suffering and loss of life. More serious academic interest in the case developed toward the end of the 19th century as understanding of psychological disorders advanced. Researchers examining the Ashworth case in the context of similar incidents began to identify patterns of behavior that could help explain how ordinary individuals could become involved in such extreme circumstances. The isolation and social pressure experienced by childless couples in rural communities during this period was identified as a contributing factor in several similar cases documented throughout England during the 18th and 19th centuries. The combination of personal disappointment, social expectations, and physical isolation appeared to create conditions that could lead to tragic outcomes when vulnerable individuals became involved. Eleanor Fairfax herself remained a figure of considerable mystery despite the detailed record she had left in her diary. Efforts to trace her background and confirm her identity proved largely unsuccessful, with no records found of her family or previous life. Some investigators suggested that Eleanor herself might have been fleeing circumstances that made her reluctant to seek official help when she first encountered difficulties, though this theory could never be verified. The remote location of Eleanor's grave on the moors meant that her remains were eventually lost to the elements and the passage of time. No permanent marker was placed to commemorate her death, and the exact location became uncertain as years passed and landmarks changed. By the early 20th century, even local residents who remembered the case could no longer identify precisely where her body had been found. The legal aspects of the case remained unresolved, as Samuel and Margaret Ashworth were never located or brought to trial. Their legal status remained that of fugitives from justice, though the practical reality was that they had almost certainly died in the years following their disappearance. The lack of legal resolution meant that many questions about the case could never be definitively answered. In 1943, during renovation work on an old farmhouse approximately 10 miles from Thornfield, workers discovered what appeared to be human remains buried beneath the stone floor of a storage cellar. The location was examined by local authorities, though wartime conditions limited the resources available for investigation. Items found with the remains included personal effects that could have belonged to either Samuel or Margaret Ashworth, though positive identification proved impossible due to the condition of the remains and the limited forensic techniques available at that time. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the Ashworth case among local historians, though few official resources were available for follow-up investigation during the war years. By the time more thorough examination became possible, the site had been disturbed by continued construction work, and much of the potential evidence had been lost. The 1950s brought the first attempt at a comprehensive historical analysis of the case. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a researcher interested in Victorian-era criminal cases, spent several years examining all available records related to the Ashworth case. Her work, published in 1958, provided the most complete account of the events and their aftermath that had been assembled up to that time. Dr. Morrison's research included interviews with elderly residents of Thornfield who retained memories of the events or had heard first-hand accounts from those who had witnessed them. These oral histories provided additional details that had not been included in the official records, particularly regarding the community's reaction to the discovery of Eleanor's death and the subsequent disappearance of the Ashworth couple. The researchers' work also examined the broader social context in which the case had occurred, analyzing the pressures and expectations that had shaped the lives of rural English families during the 1830s. Dr. Morrison argued that the Ashworth case represented an extreme example of the psychological toll that social conventions could exact on those unable to conform to expected patterns of family life. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Morrison's research uncovered additional correspondence that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Letters exchanged between the investigating magistrate and authorities in other counties revealed that similar cases had occurred elsewhere in England during the same general period, suggesting that the Ashworth case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of behavior that had emerged under specific social and economic conditions. The publication of Dr. Morrison's work sparked renewed interest in the case from both academic researchers and the general public. However, by the late 1950s, most of the physical evidence from the case had been lost or destroyed, making further investigation difficult. The cottage itself had completely collapsed, leaving only foundation stones to mark the site where the tragedy had unfolded. During the 1960s, the area around the former Ashworth cottage was incorporated into a larger agricultural development, and even the foundation stones were eventually removed to allow for more efficient farming operations. The physical traces of the case were gradually erased from the landscape, leaving only the documented records to preserve the memory of what had occurred. The case files themselves were transferred to the Yorkshire County Archives in 1966, where they became part of the permanent historical record. Researchers continued to examine the materials occasionally, though interest in the case gradually diminished as other historical topics took precedence, and the individuals involved passed from living memory into history. Today, the events that unfolded in Thornfield during 1837 and 1838 serve primarily as a historical curiosity, studied by those interested in the darker aspects of human psychology and the social conditions that can give rise to extreme behavior. The case remains significant as an example of how ordinary individuals can become involved in extraordinary circumstances that challenge conventional understanding of morality and human nature. The exact location where the Ashworth cottage once stood is no longer marked or remembered by local residents. The moorland has reclaimed the area, and visitors to the region would find no indication that it was once the site of events that captivated and horrified the local community for generations. The silence that now blankets the area seems particularly fitting for a case that began with whispered concerns about strange sounds in the night and ended with questions that may never be fully answered. The story of Eleanor Fairfax, Samuel Ashworth and Margaret Ashworth remains a testament to the capacity for human relationships to descend into manipulation, obsession, and tragedy when the normal constraints of society fail to prevent the escalation of unhealthy psychological dynamics. The case serves as a reminder that the most disturbing events often occur not in the grand gestures of obvious evil, but in the quiet, gradual progression of seemingly normal situations toward outcomes that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. The moorland winds still blow across the Yorkshire landscape where these events unfolded nearly 2 centuries ago, carrying with them only the natural sounds of weather and wildlife. No traces remain of the voices that once filled the night air with song, the footsteps that paced the floors of a cottage that no longer stands, or the secrets that were buried beneath stones that have long since been scattered. Yet somewhere in the accumulated weight of documented evidence and remembered stories, the truth of what happened during those dark months continues to echo. A reminder that some chapters of human history resist easy explanation and comfortable conclusions. The case files archived in Yorkshire contain hundreds of pages of testimony, correspondence, and official records, but they cannot capture the full scope of fear, obsession, and desperation that drove 3 individuals toward a conclusion that none of them could have anticipated when their paths first crossed on a stormy night in 1837. The documented facts tell a story of captivity and death, but the deeper questions about what drives human beings to such extremes remain as mysterious today as they were to the investigators who first attempted to make sense of the evidence. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ashworth case is not the specific acts of cruelty and violence that occurred, but the recognition that the capacity for such behavior exists within the realm of normal human psychology, waiting to emerge under the right combination of circumstances, pressures, and opportunities. The quiet moorland that now covers the site where Eleanor Fairfax drew her final breath serves as both a peaceful resting place and a sobering reminder that the darkest chapters of human experience often unfold in the most ordinary of settings, leaving behind only questions that refuse to be silenced by the passage of time.